So let's talk about revision. Some of the best advice I've ever gotten about revising poetry came from the book A Poetry Writer's Handbook by Mary Oliver. You've heard me talk about her before. She's a poet I really like. But I just wanted to share 3 of the quotes from that chapter that I find really relevant to the poetry revising process. So the first one is, what matters is that you consider what you have on the page as an unfinished piece of work. As you go to revise a poem, just go in with the mindset that this piece of work is not done. If you think that it's finished, it's going to be hard to start revising. And if you really think it's finished, maybe you don't need to. Sometimes with poetry, revision isn't necessary because there isn't a right or wrong way to write a poem. However, I want you to encourage you to revise your poetry. The second quote is, poems are imaginative constructs, and they do not exist to tell us about the poet or the poet's actual experience. They exist in order to be poems. What I really like about this quote is that it allows us to be free from the idea that we need to tell a real story in our poem. It's okay to start with a real story or an actual experience, but then allow yourself to move beyond that. Sometimes the poem just ends up having a life of its own, or the speaker of the poem ends up not being you, but ends up being many voices, or a voice of a person a little bit like you, but who's had a slightly different experience. Don't worry about a poem telling a true story. A poem can tell whatever story the poem tells. The third quote I really like is, I like to say that I write poems for a stranger who will be born in some distant country hundreds of years from now. The reason I like this quote when I consider revising poetry is that it allows us to think of our poem as a work that stands on its own. Yes, sometimes it's beneficial to learn about the poet as you're analyzing poetry, but really, the poem should have everything it needs inside it to tell the story that it needs to tell. And it should have something in it that is relevant to a variety of different people. That's one of the things I love about reading and writing poetry is that it really can relate to so many different people in a variety of different ways. Here are a few tips for revising poetry. Just like any other written work, you should read it out loud for fluency and to test your meter. So, poetry is really meant to be read out loud because it has that song-like quality. So, reading it aloud will allow you to understand what your poem sounds like. It's also helpful if you can get somebody else to read it out loud for you, but if you're not comfortable with that, just read it out loud to yourself and listen to the way it sounds. Does it sound the same way you wanted it to sound in your head? Next, consider word choice. Just like you would in an essay or a piece of prose, look at each word and see, does it fit with the mood or tone? Does it go with what you're trying to say? Is there a word that you could use that might convey your message better? And if there is, swap them out. Third, examine figurative language. Look at the figurative language you did or perhaps didn't use. If you didn't use a lot, try to work more in, especially sensory images. This really brings your poem to life. As you do this, if you have figurative language that is cliche or overused, consider revising that. See how you could make your figurative language unique and original to tell the story of your poem. Next, have someone tell you about your poem, then ask yourself, is that what I intended? This might sound a little bit confusing, but it's essentially just having a writer's workshop with a trusted friend. Go to this friend with your poem or family member and say, read this poem, tell me what you think it means. If they tell you something that's close to what you intended, or maybe is even better than what you intended, then great, you're doing well. But if what they tell you is so far away from your intention of the poem, then maybe you should consider how you could revise it to fit your intention better. Finally, don't be afraid to use your resources. Consider using a rhyming dictionary or a thesaurus in order to swap out your word choice and edit your words the best way. You could also use your resources by being inspired by other poets or lyricists and incorporating their lines and ideas into your own work in a unique or original way. I really like the TED Talk Steal Like an Artist when I think about using your resources. I'll link that below. But as you revise, consider how you could weave in inspiration from other creative works around you. I've shared with you a lot of quotes throughout the series about what a poem is. As you revise, I want to share with you this quote from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a British Romantic poet. He said, "A poem is the best words in the best order." This might sound really daunting when you're considering revision because best is a high standard to work up towards. But the thought I want to leave you with is that you, as the poet, get to decide what best means in the context of your poem. Look at your poem critically. Do you have the best words in the best order? If you can say yes to that after your revision is done, you've done a great job. Have a great day, and good luck revising your poetry.